Your comments, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to contribute to this meeting here this morning. As you know, I have made a detailed submission to the committee, and I hope that the committee will consider that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But it very much dovetails with the presentation earlier by the Irish Farmers Association and Mr Joe Healy, and I want to deal with it initially in that context. Just the IFA have made a very valid proposal, and that is that the test in relation to farming would replicate what is already in primary legislation in terms of agriculture relief in the Finance Acts. And I believe that it is of fundamental importance that there is a consistency across government in relation to this, because we're going to create absolute confusion. And the objective behind the provision that is here before us today is to remove anomalies that are currently within the Fair Deal scheme. It shouldn't be about creating other anomalies. And if we do not take the agricultural relief as the definition here, we are going to create other anomalies, and I will reference that in a second. Mr Redmond, in your response to that point that was made by my colleagues earlier, you differentiated the fact that this was a land mobility policy, and because of that it shouldn't be looked at in terms of the Fair Deal nursing home support scheme. And I appreciate where you're coming from in relation to that, but what you're actually doing is creating a further anomaly in the system, and we will have to come back and re-amend this, because it will actually undermine the clear objective and policy of government to provide for land mobility. Because if the legislation is drafted as you're currently proposing, it will mean that many people who would wish to go into long-term leasing will not do so, because they could be discriminated against should they go into long-term nursing home care. Now, you also, in your defence of not moving from this position, state that it would threaten the equity of the scheme, and there is a constitutional issue in terms of equity. And I'm glad that you brought up the issue of equity, because that is the main reason that I want to contribute to the committee hearing here this morning. And taking the example that Mr Healy has given in his contribution today, can you explain to me the justification under the proposals as they now stand, that a person who leases their land, and let's say for the first 3 years, beyond 3 years we can argue over that, and I hope you will amend it, but just let's take for the first 3 years. First of all, 3.5% of the capital value of that farm is now taken into account as part of the nursing home support scheme. On top of that, the rental income from that land is also considered income for the calculation under the Fair Deal nursing home scheme. And thirdly, if that money in all likelihood would go through that older person's bank account, that money is considered capital on deposit in that account. So the same piece of land is going to be charged 3 times under the nursing home support scheme. Now, can you explain to me how that is equitable, how that is constitutional, and how that is right? And it is not just in relation to the farmland. This is also the case in terms of private homes as well. And the situation is that at the moment we have 5 vacant homes of older people that are in long-term nursing home care for every single homeless family in this country today. And the problem is that the dots just don't join up. There are over 9,000 vacant homes where the owners have gone into long-term nursing home care. And in a bizarre twist of the current policy under the Fair Deal scheme, we're effectively banning the renting out of vacant homes belonging to older people in nursing homes because they'll be hit on the treble under the penalty system that is currently in place under the Fair Deal nursing home scheme. And that penalty is that if an older person in private or in long-term nursing home care under the Fair Deal scheme, the capital value of that house is firstly taken into account, 7.5% per annum. On top of that, if they're unfortunate enough to rent out that house, the income generated from that property is also taken into account as income. And in all likelihood, again, that money is likely to go through that older person's bank account. That is considered capital on deposit in that account and is charged at 7.5%. So, in other words, we have 9,000 vacant houses out there, some of whom, and it may be a small cohort, we don't know, but I definitely am aware of families where they are prepared to rent out that particular property. But the difficulty is at the moment, that older person would pay 3 times for the same property. Now, that is not equitable. And what's even more bizarre is through the state programme under the National Broadband Scheme, we have 1,000 megabit per second high-speed broadband outside some of these vacant homes that could accommodate families, infrastructure being put in, and yet the house has weeds growing up outside it. So the problem is that we are actually undermining a stated government policy of trying to reopen vacant houses across the country because we have put this penalty in place. And reflecting what Mr Healy has said, and I've made it in my own submission, all I'm looking for here is equity, fairness and transparency. One property should be calculated once under the means assessment. And if we go to the Department of Social Protection, non-contributory old age pension, the mechanism that is there in terms of a capital asset, if the capital asset is generating an income, that income is taken into account. So if it's a farm and it's being leased out, the lease income from that farm is taken as the income. Or if the person is farming the land, the income generated from the farm is taken into account. And if it is not being farmed, if it is not being leased, then the capital value of that land is taken into account. And in terms of a property, if it's not the principal primary residence, which is excluded under the social welfare scheme, but any other property, it's the capital value of that property or the income that is generated from that property. Now, I have no difficulty in people paying their fair share. I'm not looking for any sweetheart deal or anything here in terms of farmers or in terms of older people that own property. But I'm looking for, as what you said, Mr Redmond, equity. One property, should be included in a means assessment once, not twice, and definitely not 3 times. And that is the fundamental anomaly that is there in the nursing home support scheme at the moment, in terms of the lease of farmland and in terms of the leasing out of homes. And the argument will be made, and will be made by your colleagues or the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. Look, we'll deal with what we have at the moment and we'll come back and revisit this. The difficulty is we're reviewing this scheme since 2012. I had a condition written into the programme for government to actually fast forward this because of the failure to move this along over the previous 4 years prior to the drafting of the programme for government. And thanks to the support of individuals like Maura Canning from the IFA, we have brought the progress here. And I accept Minister Jim Daly has done a lot of work. I accept that each and every one of you here have done a lot of work. I know the barriers and bottlenecks that you have dealt with from other arms of government because I've been at Cabinet pushing through some of those particular difficulties. But now that we have the chance to take anomalies out of the system, to introduce an element of fairness and equity into the system, we should do that. So I'm asking you to do 2 things. One, is to take the definition of agricultural relief that is there and incorporate it into the provisions here, a copy and paste from the Finance Act. And secondly, in terms of capital assessment, to copy and paste the current primary legislation that is there under the Department of Social Protection and treat it equitable. That's all we're looking for, is equity in relation to this. Just one final point, Chair, that I want to flag when I have the opportunity here. Overall, we're conservatively looking at 50,000 vacant homes across the country. Now, the Fair Deal boycott is one element in relation to that. Another element in relation to the blockage of these homes is the issue of probate. In my own county of Roscommon, my adjoining county of Galway, people have to wait on average 3.5 months for that to be processed. If you're unfortunate enough to live in Kilkenny, it's 4.5 months. Cork City, 2.5 months. Waterford City, 3.5 months. Now, these are areas of the country where there is demand for housing, and yet the probate system is blocking these houses being released onto the market. We have 1.75 million homes across the country. We need to be utilising those in the best possible way, working with older people, working with older people's families to unblock some of these blockages. And I would hope that the committee members here, along with the officials and the department, will look at the blockage that has been created by the Fair Deal and not create a future anomaly in relation to farm leasing. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Naughton. Mr. Redmond.
Yep, thank you, and thank you, Deputy Naughton, in relation to that. I think in terms of the situation with regard to equity, I think, and I know we've mentioned it a few times this morning, but I think it's important that we look at what the Fair Deal scheme is, we look at its purpose, we look at the policy objectives for that scheme, and we look at the policy objectives, I suppose, in relation to the heads of bill that we've developed. When we go back to the times before Fair Deal existed, and I'm kind of conscious, and I've reread them recently in terms of some of the debates that happened in the Oireachtas around the introduction of that Act in 2008. And you know, one of the major issues that Fair Deal tried to correct, I suppose, was the fact that people with very similar means were paying very different levels of contribution. And part of what Fair Deal attempts to do is to provide a situation where you pay your contribution towards your care based on the means that you have, which effectively boils down to the more means you have, the more you pay, and the less means you have, the less you pay. And I think what's being suggested would fundamentally move away from that, irrespective of the other policies that may exist. And those other policies that exist in relation to other matters of government, they have a particular policy intent and a particular policy objective. I'm not necessarily convinced that this undermines any of those. I think this is a different policy intent, and I think the fundamentals of the nursing home support scheme being based on financial assessment of means, I think would be significantly undone if we were to do anything else in relation to that, and I think would actually create a situation where we're back to a situation again that we were in previously, where people who are sharing, for example, a similar residence in a similar nursing home, where one person has more means than the other but contributes less to the scheme. And I think those are the days that the scheme tried to amend, tried to fix, and we've done well, I think, in terms of doing that and supporting 100,000 people over the last 10 years. I think any move backwards in relation to that, I think, will create significant difficulties for the scheme.
And I hear exactly what you're saying, Mr. Redmond, and I do not absolutely disagree with that. I wholeheartedly agree with it, that if you have more means, you pay more, and that is a fundamental tenet of the scheme and should be a fundamental tenet of the scheme. But I vehemently oppose the fact that you have a single asset and you pay 3 times for that single asset. And let me make it clear, you're drafting the legislation at the moment. I don't know what the formulation of the House is going to be when this legislation goes through, but I can tell you this much: whoever the Minister of the day is bringing this primary legislation through the House will not be in a position to defend a situation where you paid 3 times for a single asset. That is inequitable, it's unconstitutional, it's unfair, and I would urge you to reconsider exactly what I've said while you're drafting this legislation, and ensure that it is and does provide the equity that we all believe should be part of the scheme.
Thanks. I suppose just to mention, and obviously we've been concentrating on, I suppose, on what's in the heads of bill naturally this morning. We are having significant engagement with the Department of Housing just in relation to the issue of vacant homes, and I think the issue, and you brought up the issue in relation to rental income, and I think that's a particularly difficult one, again, for the same principles as I've outlined. There's no income within the scheme currently that's treated any differently to other types of income, and I think trying to segregate out rental income and treat that differently and not have a situation where there's inequitable treatment there is a major issue, and I don't think, in terms of the way the scheme is set up, in terms of what the scheme is intended to do, I don't think that's going to work. But however, we are looking at, and it goes back to the issue of the cap, and the precedent in relation to the cap does exist obviously in the scheme and has been a feature of the scheme since day one. So we are working with the Department of Housing to look at, for example, the possibility of capping the proceeds from the sale of a home at 3 years. So currently, the situation in the scheme is, and this is an anomaly that I think can be addressed, is if you have the physical property and the value of the physical property, you pay the 7.5% for the 3 years, and then it's capped. If you decide to sell that property, either before going to care or when you're in care, the proceeds, the cash from that asset, and I think you've mentioned it, are treated without a cap. So if you were in nursing home care for 10 years, you'd be paying 75% of it. So there's definitely an issue there in terms of that, and obviously that would be a barrier to people selling on the property. So we are committed to having a look at that. It would be our intention, just in terms of how quickly we can get through, but it would be our intention that we could try and see the possibility, if people were in agreement, that we could try and piggyback an amendment to the scheme in relation to this bill when it eventually does come up, and that's something I think we can do. I think one of the issues I do think, just more broadly, is trying to get kind of good evidence and a good methodology, I suppose, behind realistically, and this goes back to the issue of proportionality and the issue of sort of the rationale or the rational process for delivering a policy objective, is trying to understand realistically how many vacant homes are out there that are a direct result of a person going to long-term care. Unfortunately, and there is some data that came out of the 2016 census. The difficulty, I think, and I think the CSO has highlighted that in its disclaimers, for want of a better word, is that it was a small process that was done on an experimental basis, and I think we need to try and see, and we're working with housing to see what we can do around trying to just get a better handle on what the figures might be and have a more robust methodology for looking at those. And I think the second part of that equation then is trying to understand, what's the realistic benefit to, I suppose, in terms of freeing up homes, in terms of making any change to the scheme. And that's a difficult one in itself, because if you take something like, for example, rental income, just because something is a possibility doesn't mean that people will actually follow through. And there may be a whole host of reasons for that, not least because what you're talking about is people who themselves may not be vulnerable but are in vulnerable positions in terms of their generally of older age in a nursing home with various medical and other needs. And for them to take on the role of landlord and all of the legal implications that has and all of the legal responsibilities that has, I'm not sure realistically how likely that is to happen in a large scale. And I think that's just an important aspect when we look at this. But I think the more important piece is trying to segregate a particular type of income and treat it differently to every other income, and have a situation where, as I've said, where people with different means are paying different contributions, but not based on paying more because they have more means, but paying less because they have more means. I think that would create a very fundamental unfairness in this scheme.
Just very briefly now, because I'm not going to get involved in this any greater extent, but 2 points here. Absolutely, in terms of the numbers, the statistics I've given you in terms of the 9,000 are HSE figures from the Nursing Home Support Scheme, and they're on foot of a parliamentary reply. Yes, I believe there's quite a lot of older people, there's a lot of their families don't want to rent out the properties, and that's fair enough. That's their own decision in relation to it. And yes, what of an impact it's going to have is very hard to know until you actually do it. But the fundamental issue is here that the Department of Social Protection have a very equitable and fair and defensible system of calculating income. But we're saying in the nursing home support scheme that if you have a particular type of income, then you pay for it 3 times. Now, that's wrong. That's inequitable, it's immoral, and needs to be changed. And all I'm asking you to do is to look back over what I've just said this morning, look at what the legislation is in the Department of Social Protection, and bring a bit of fairness into the Fair Deal scheme. Thank you.